History loves talking about conquerors, kings, and geniuses. This video is about the poor soul's fate used as a punching bag instead. People who survived atomic bombs, missed fortunes by inches, got wrecked by freak accidents, or somehow became magnets for disaster. These are 32 people in history who were not just unlucky but almost comically cursed. 1. Robert Todd Lincoln had the kind of reputation no president would ever want attached to a guest list. He was Abraham Lincoln's eldest son, and he rushed to his father's bedside after the assassination at Ford's Theater. Tragic enough already, but somehow that was only the beginning. In 1881, Robert was near President James Garfield at a train station when Garfield was shot. Then, in 1901, President William McKinley invited him to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, which sounds innocent until you remember McKinley was assassinated there too. 3 presidents, 3 murders, 1 extremely cursed witness. At some point, Robert basically looked at the White House calendar and said, "Absolutely not, I am not attending another event where a president might appear." He reportedly even admitted that presidential functions seemed to go badly when he was around. Imagine being so unlucky you quietly remove yourself from democracy for public safety. 2. Tsutomu Yamaguchi may be the most brutal example of being in the wrong place at the worst possible time. He was a Japanese marine engineer on a business trip to Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, which was already a historically terrible date to have on your travel itinerary. He survived the atomic bombing, badly burned and shaken but alive, which feels impossible enough on its own. Then, instead of disappearing into the mountains forever, he managed to make his way home to Nagasaki. Yes, Nagasaki. On August 9th, bandaged and exhausted, he went into work and tried explaining to his boss that one bomb had wiped out an entire city. The boss thought that sounded insane. Then the second atomic bomb exploded. Right there, 3 days, 2 nuclear blasts. Same man. He survived both and lived into old age. But that remains the single worst business trip anyone has ever taken in human history. 3. Guillaume Le Gentil did not just have bad luck. He had the kind of luck that feels personal, like the universe singled him out for sport. This French astronomer wanted to observe the transit of Venus, a rare event with huge scientific value. So in 1761, he traveled toward India, only for war between Britain and France to wreck the whole plan. His ship could not safely land, and he ended up stuck at sea while the event happened without him. Most people would call that a disaster and go home. Le Gentil decided to wait for the next transit of Venus instead. The next one was 8 years later. He stayed, prepared, and patiently built his second chance. On the big day, the weather was perfect until the exact moment it mattered. Then one cloud drifted over and blocked the sun. One cloud. After 11 years away, he returned to France and discovered everyone assumed he was dead. His wife had remarried, and his property was gone. That is not misfortune. That is a cosmic mugging. 4. Ruben Nsimo was a teenage goalkeeper in Georgia who went into a soccer match speaking English and woke up from a coma, sounding like he had just moved in from Madrid. During a game, he took a vicious kick to the head while diving for the ball. He stopped breathing, slipped into a coma for 3 days, and his family feared the worst. Then he woke up and started speaking with fluent Spanish patterns, even though Spanish was not his normal language. He had never magically transformed into a bilingual genius overnight. Doctors connected it to a rare condition linked to brain trauma, often called foreign accent syndrome, where the brain scrambles speech in bizarre ways. For a while, his English sounded foreign to the people who knew him best, and he struggled to get his usual voice back. He eventually recovered much of his normal speech, but for a stretch, his brain basically hit the wrong settings menu and rebooted him in a completely different language mode. 5. Henry Gunther managed to miss surviving World War I by roughly the amount of time it takes to sneeze. He was an American soldier on November 11, 1918, the exact day the armistice was set to end the war at 11 in the morning. Everyone knew the finish line was right there. This was not a mystery ending. Peace had been agreed. The clock was practically screaming for people to just stay alive for one more minute. Then, at 10:59, Henry charged a German machine gun position against orders. The Germans, who knew the war was seconds from ending, reportedly tried to wave him off. They were basically saying, "Do not do this, we are all done here." But Henry kept going. They fired, and he was killed instantly. 1 minute later, the guns fell silent across the front. He became the last American and widely remembered as the last soldier killed in the war, surviving years of trench warfare only to die 60 seconds before peace is almost offensively cruel. 6. Daisuke Inoue helped create one of humanity's favorite nighttime hobbies, which is standing in public and destroying perfectly good songs. In 1971, he came up with the karaoke machine, a brilliant idea that turned bars into emotional confession booths with microphones. It spread everywhere because, obviously, people love pretending they can sing once enough drinks are involved. The only problem was that Inoue did not patent it. He thought patenting the idea would be greedy, which is a beautiful sentiment if your goal is to inspire mankind, and a terrible one if your goal is to get paid. Companies copied the machine, mass-produced it, and made enormous fortunes from his invention, while he earned basically nothing from the global karaoke empire he started. He later received an Ig Nobel Peace Prize for giving people a new way to tolerate one another, which is funny but also wildly depressing. Imagine inventing a gold mine and getting rewarded with applause while everyone else carts away the gold. 7. Masabumi Hosono survived the Titanic and then got punished for it, which is such a cruel twist it barely sounds real. He was the only Japanese passenger aboard the ship, and when the disaster unfolded, he found a place in a lifeboat and lived. In most countries, that would make you a grateful survivor with a harrowing story. In Japan, it turned into a public shaming campaign. Newspapers and officials treated him like he had committed some moral crime because he saved himself instead of dying nobly with the ship. The whole thing got tangled up with ideals about duty, honor, and sacrifice, as if freezing to death in the Atlantic was somehow the more respectable option. His reputation was ruined, his career suffered, and he became a national example of what not to do. Just think about that for a second. He escaped one of the deadliest maritime disasters ever and then came home to be told the real mistake was not drowning. That is bad luck with a side order of national judgment. 8. Edwin Hubble helped humanity understand that the universe is far bigger and stranger than anyone had imagined, and somehow the Nobel Prize still managed to miss the point. He proved that there were galaxies beyond the Milky Way and provided crucial evidence that the universe was expanding, which is not exactly a minor contribution. That is history-shifting, reality-rearranging science. You would assume the Nobel Committee would sprint to hand him a medal. Instead, for years, they treated astronomy like it was some decorative hobby with a telescope rather than serious physics. Hubble spent much of his career pushing for the field to be properly recognized. Eventually, the committee softened and changed the rules, which should have been his moment. But in one final act of cosmic sarcasm, Hubble died of a stroke in 1953 just before any award could officially happen. Nobel Prizes are not given posthumously, so the door opened only after the man who kicked it down was already gone. He changed our view of everything and still got left outside. 9. Jerome Irving. Rodale built an entire public identity around health, longevity, and the idea that clean living would keep you around forever. He was the kind of man who made modern wellness culture look relaxed. Organic food, exercise, natural health, the whole package. In 1971, he appeared on television ready to preach the gospel of living right. During the interview, he confidently claimed he was so healthy, he had fallen down a long flight of stairs and laughed the whole way. He also bragged that he planned to live to 100. That is the kind of sentence you should probably never say out loud with cameras rolling. Moments later, while attention shifted elsewhere on the set, Rodale slumped forward. The audience initially thought he was joking or doing some strange bit because he was known for being eccentric. He was not joking. He had suffered a massive heart attack and died almost instantly. So yes, the prophet of immortality basically announced his invincibility on national television and then exited the planet less than a minute later. You cannot script irony that mean. 10. Martin Todd experienced the special kind of pain that only paperwork can create. He and his wife realized they had the winning numbers for a United Kingdom lottery jackpot worth millions. For a brief shining moment, life was glorious. Every boring problem was gone. Bills, stress, ordinary life, all replaced by fantasies of freedom and comfort. Then came the problem that turned everything into a nightmare. They could not find the ticket. They searched everywhere, contacted the lottery organizers, and got the most agonizing confirmation imaginable. Records showed that Martin had indeed bought the winning ticket. So this was not a fantasy or a mistaken memory. He actually won. The organizers knew it. He knew it. Everyone knew it. But because of the rule requiring the physical ticket, they refused to pay him. Not one penny. Imagine being officially right and still completely powerless. The fight dragged on for years, the stress consumed his life, and the whole disaster reportedly wrecked his marriage. Losing millions because of one missing slip of paper is the kind of bad luck that should qualify as emotional torture. 11. King Alexander of Greece did not die in battle, in a coup, or from some grand palace conspiracy. He died because two monkeys turned a royal walk into a disaster with geopolitical consequences. In 1920, Alexander was out in the palace gardens with his German shepherd when a domestic macaque attacked the dog. The king stepped in to break up the chaos, which already sounds like a sentence no monarch should ever have to deal with. Another monkey joined in and bit him on the leg and torso. The wounds did not seem dramatic at first, but infection set in, sepsis followed, and within weeks the king was dead. That would already be a ridiculous royal obituary. But his death also helped trigger a chain reaction in Greek politics, including the return of his exiled father and a disastrous campaign against Turkey. Later observers argued that this absurd animal scuffle helped shape events that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Imagine history turning on military blunders, dynastic crisis, and one very aggressive monkey deciding today felt spicy. 12. King Umberto I of Italy stumbled into one of the creepiest coincidence stories ever recorded, the kind that sounds fake until the ending gets even worse. One evening, he visited a small restaurant and noticed the owner looked exactly like him. Not vaguely similar. Not same mustache, close enough. Identical. Curious, the king spoke to him, and the similarities got stranger by the minute. They had been born on the same day, March 14, 1844, in the same town. They had both married women named Margherita. The restaurant owner had opened his business on the exact day Umberto became king. At this point, fate was not being subtle anymore. Then the universe decided that eerie coincidence alone was not enough. The next day, Umberto learned that the restaurant owner had been killed in a shooting. The king was reportedly shaken by the news. Moments later, while attending a public event, Umberto himself was shot dead by an anarchist. Same face, same birthday, same strange life markers, and almost the same ending. That is not a coincidence. That feels like destiny showing off. 13. Before Adolphe Sax invented the instrument that would one day dominate jazz clubs and dramatic movie soundtracks, he spent his childhood apparently trying out every possible way a human can almost die. His own mother reportedly believed he was doomed by bad luck, and honestly, the evidence was stacking up fast. He fell from a third-story window. He swallowed a needle. He drank acidic liquid by mistake. He was badly burned in a gunpowder explosion. He crashed onto a hot cast iron pan. He nearly drowned. At one point, he was also hit in the head by falling masonry because apparently ordinary danger was not enough for his schedule. By any reasonable standard, this child should not have made it to adulthood. Yet he kept surviving, over and over, like death was missing its cue. Eventually, he grew up, invented the saxophone, and permanently changed music. So every time you hear a smooth sax solo sliding through the speakers, remember the instrument exists because its inventor somehow treated fatal accidents like a hobby and still refused to leave the stage. 14. Marcus Garvey endured one of the most viciously absurd endings imaginable because a newspaper decided facts were optional. Garvey was a major political figure in the Black nationalist movement, controversial, influential, and already in fragile health by 1940 after suffering a stroke in London. Then, the Chicago Defender ran an obituary for him before he had actually died. Not only was it premature, it was insulting. It painted him as broke, isolated, and irrelevant, which is an especially nasty thing to read when you are very much alive and trying to recover. Imagine opening a paper and finding a public summary of your life that reads like your enemies wrote it. Garvey was devastated and enraged by the article. The shock reportedly contributed to a second, more severe stroke. This time, he did die. So in one of history's ugliest examples of media recklessness, fake news about Marcus Garvey's death became part of what actually killed him. It was not just bad journalism. It was practically an assisted obituary. 15. Melanie Martinez from Louisiana had the kind of relationship with hurricanes that makes you wonder whether the weather was tracking her with a personal grudge. Over the course of about 50 years, she lost 5 different homes to 5 different storms. 1 house destroyed is tragic. 2 is cruel. 5 starts to feel like the atmosphere itself is being sarcastic. Hurricane Betsy took the first one in 1965. Then Juan, then George, then Katrina, and finally Isaac came along to finish the collection, like some terrible natural disaster loyalty program. Each time she rebuilt or relocated within the same storm-prone region, and each time nature came back around with another direct hit. The media eventually called her the unluckiest woman in America, which honestly feels less like a headline and more like an official title at that point. After the 5th house was wiped out, you could be forgiven for assuming the weather map simply checked where Melanie lived and adjusted course. Her life story makes insurance paperwork look like a horror genre. 16. Anne Hodges is the only person in recorded history confirmed to have been hit by a meteorite, which is not exactly the kind of uniqueness anyone asks for. In 1954, she was at home in Alabama doing something extremely dangerous, apparently, which was taking a nap on her couch. Out of nowhere, a rock from outer space tore through her roof, bounced off a radio console, and smashed into her hip. She survived, though with a huge bruise and a story nobody would believe if the actual space rock had not been sitting there as evidence. That alone should have been enough chaos for 1 lifetime. But then came the earthly nonsense. Instead of peacefully keeping the meteorite that had nearly murdered her from orbit, she got dragged into a legal fight because her landlord claimed the rock belonged to the property, not to the woman it had personally attacked. So Anne survived a random celestial strike and then had to wrestle with property law. That is the full human experience right there. First the cosmos hits you, then paperwork finishes the job. 17. Robert Falcon. Scott made one of the most punishing journeys in exploration history, only to discover that the one thing worse than dying in Antarctica is dying in Antarctica after finishing second. Scott led a British expedition to the South Pole through conditions that were basically a frozen assault on human existence. His team hauled supplies across ice, battled exhaustion, frostbite, starvation, and soul-crushing distances, all for the glory of being first to the bottom of the world. After months of suffering, they finally approached the pole in January 1912 and saw something flapping in the distance. It was not triumph. It was the Norwegian flag. Roald Amundsen had beaten them there by more than a month. Scott wrote of the crushing disappointment, and you can feel the despair dripping from every line. Then came the return journey, 800 miles of misery with no victory to justify it. Scott and his companions died in their tent during a blizzard, knowing they had endured hell itself only to become the answer to the cruelest silver medal story ever told. 18. John Sutter owned the land where one of the greatest gold discoveries in history happened, and somehow he still ended up broke, which tells you everything about how savage a gold rush really is. In 1848, gold was found at his mill in California. On paper, that should have made him absurdly rich. He was sitting on the dream, but gold fever does not arrive politely with contracts and handshakes. It arrives like a human flood. Once news leaked, hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers poured into the region. Instead of paying Sutter or helping him profit, they trampled his crops, stole livestock, stripped materials, wrecked his operations, and treated his property like a free buffet attached to a treasure chest. He legally owned the land, But ownership means very little when an entire frontier loses its mind at once. So the man on whose property the California gold rush exploded did not become its king. He became one of its victims, spending the rest of his life begging the government for compensation while other people got rich off the chaos growing from his soil. 19. Wilmer McLean had perhaps the worst luck ever recorded in real estate because the American Civil War practically treated him like a preferred venue. At the start of the conflict, he was living in Manassas, Virginia, minding his business as a grocer and family man when the First Battle of Bull Run erupted right near his home. Fighting tore through the area, and at one point a cannonball reportedly crashed through his kitchen chimney, which is a fairly rude way for a national crisis to announce itself. McLean decided he had seen enough of history and moved his family far away to the quiet village of Appomattox, hoping for peace and anonymity. That sounds sensible. It also sounds like something fate heard and took personally. 4 years later, as the war finally staggered toward its end, General Lee's representatives needed a house where surrender terms could be discussed. Out of all the buildings in the area, they chose Wilmer McLean's new home. The war began in his yard and ended in his parlor. History did not just visit him twice, it forwarded its mail. 20. Antonio Meucci is one of those men who should be a household name and instead got run over by the combined force of bad timing and not having enough cash in his pocket. Long before Alexander Graham Bell became the poster boy for the telephone, Meucci had developed a voice communication device and demonstrated versions of it in New York. He had the idea, the experiments, and the technical work. What he did not have was financial stability. In 1874, he needed $10 to renew his patent caveat, and he could not afford it. $10. That tiny barrier turned into one of the most expensive moments in invention history. 2 years later, Bell secured the patent for the telephone and rode that victory into fame and fortune. Meucci spent years trying to defend his claim, but he died poor and largely forgotten. Imagine helping build one of the most transformative technologies ever created and losing credit because you were short the equivalent of a very depressing dinner bill. That is not just unfair. That is a historical mugging in broad daylight. 21. Edward A. Murphy. Jr. is remembered by almost everyone on Earth, but not for the reason he actually wanted. His name became attached to Murphy's Law, the gloomy idea that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. That sounds like the motto of a tired office worker whose printer just exploded. In reality, Murphy was an aerospace engineer working on high-speed rocket sled experiments for the Air Force. He was not trying to create a philosophy of despair. He was trying to prevent mistakes. The phrase came out of frustration after a sensor was installed incorrectly, and his point was basically that if there is a wrong way to do something, somebody will eventually do it that way unless systems are designed carefully. It was meant as a warning about safety and precision. Then the world grabbed it, polished off the engineering context, and turned Murphy into the patron saint of disaster. So the man who spent his career trying to stop errors became forever associated with inevitable failure. Honestly, that outcome is probably the purest possible demonstration of Murphy's Law. 22. Walter Cavanier's early life reads less like a biography and more like a stressed-out stunt coordinator screaming that the insurance company will never approve this. By the time he was 20, he had already survived enough calamity for several lifetimes. He was struck by lightning. He was bitten by a venomous snake. He nearly drowned. He also survived not one but 2 separate plane crashes, which is an insane statistic even for someone who spends every weekend performing reckless air tricks. Most people go their whole lives without getting close to one of those events. Walter stacked them like achievements in a nightmare video game. Depending on how you look at it, he was either extraordinarily lucky for surviving or astonishingly unlucky for landing in those situations at all. Personally, getting the survival badge after repeated meetings with catastrophe does not feel like luck. It feels like your guardian angel is pulling double shifts, skipping lunch, and filing complaints with management. At some point, statistics looked at Walter and just gave up trying to be relevant. 23. Ramon Artagavedia spent 40 years avoiding the sea after surviving a horrifying ship fire, only to finally trust modern technology and board the one ocean liner history would make famous for sinking. In 1871, he escaped disaster aboard the ship America, an experience so traumatic that he refused to travel by sea again for decades. That sounds reasonable. If the ocean nearly kills you once, maybe let it keep its distance. But eventually, family and friends convinced him that the world had changed. Ships were safer now. Engineering was better. This new liner was luxurious, advanced, and supposedly unsinkable. The sales pitch was irresistible, especially with all the new safety features people bragged about. So in 1912, after 40 years of avoiding maritime travel, Ramon finally stepped back onto the water. The ship he boarded was the Titanic. Out of every vessel he could have chosen on Earth, fate steered him straight onto the most infamous one. That is not normal bad luck. That is the universe slowly setting up a punchline for 4 decades and then delivering it with an iceberg. 24. Rosalind Franklin helped unlock one of biology's greatest discoveries and then watched history hand the applause to other people. She was a brilliant chemist and X-ray crystallographer whose work was crucial to revealing the structure of DNA. Her famous image known as Photo 51 provided powerful evidence of the double helix. In plain language, she produced one of the most important scientific clues of the 20th century. The problem was that the clue was shown to Watson and Crick without her permission. They immediately grasped what it meant, used that insight, and published the model that made them legends. Their names entered every classroom. Franklin's contribution was pushed into the shadows for years. Then came another layer of cruelty. She died young from cancer, likely after years of radiation exposure from her research, long before any full correction of the record could help her. So the woman who helped reveal the code of life sacrificed her health to science, while the fame and the trophy largely went elsewhere. That is not just unfair. That is theft wearing a lab coat. 25. Ronald Wayne made one of the most expensive exits in business history after spending less than 2 weeks as a co-founder of Apple. While Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were the dreamers, Wayne was brought in as the older, steadier presence, the responsible adult who could help keep things organized. But he quickly grew nervous about the risks. Unlike the younger founders, he had more to lose if the company collapsed and creditors came hunting. So just 12 days after Apple was formed, he signed away his 10% stake for $800. At the time, that probably felt like a sensible move, the kind people defend by saying they wanted peace of mind. Unfortunately, Apple did not become a tiny failed startup. It became one of the most valuable companies on Earth. That 10% would later be worth well over $100 billion. So yes, Ronald Wayne effectively traded generational wealth beyond imagination for the price of furniture and a little temporary comfort. You can call that caution. History calls it one of the most painful what-ifs ever. 26. Alan Pinkerton spent his life building a legendary reputation as a detective, tough enough to handle spies, outlaws, and assassination plots, only to die in a way that sounds like the universe trolling him. This was the founder of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a man associated with undercover work, railroad security, and foiling threats against Abraham Lincoln. You would expect his final chapter to involve gunfire, pursuit, maybe a dramatic confrontation in a shadowy alley. Instead, while walking in Chicago, Pinkerton slipped on the pavement and bit his tongue. That should have been an embarrassing story for dinner, not the end of a famous life. But this was the 19th century when even minor injuries could turn vicious. The wound became infected, gangrene set in, and the infection killed him. So after surviving a career spent chasing dangerous men, Alan Pinkerton was taken out not by a criminal mastermind but by one bad fall and his own teeth. It is the most anticlimactic exit imaginable, which somehow makes it even crueler. 27. Jack Daniel, the whiskey icon himself, did not go out in a glorious haze of drink, scandal, or frontier chaos. He died because he got mad at a safe. One morning in 1911, he arrived at work, tried to open his office safe, and could not remember the combination. Reasonable people might have called for help, taken a breath, or maybe had some coffee first. Jack chose violence. He kicked the heavy steel safe hard enough to injure his toe. It was a ridiculous little moment of frustration, the kind most people would forget by lunch. But the injury got infected, and in an era before modern antibiotics, that was no small matter. The infection worsened, spread through his body, and eventually killed him. So the man whose name became one of the most famous labels in liquor history essentially died because he threw a tantrum at office furniture. It is one of those stories so absurd you almost laugh before remembering it is real. He built a whiskey empire and lost to a metal box. 28. Kostas Mitsotakis lived just outside the Spanish village of Sodeto in 2011, which turned out to be a terrible place to be forgotten for exactly one reason. The village, struggling through hard economic times, did what many Spanish communities do and pooled money into shares of the giant Christmas lottery known as El Gordo. Nearly every household got in on it. The tickets were sold around the village, neighbors included neighbors, and the whole thing felt like a shared ritual. Except nobody knocked on Kostas's door. He was living in a barn just outside the village center, and the women selling the tickets simply forgot about him. Then, the village won. Not a little win either. An enormous, life-changing jackpot spread across the community, turning ordinary households into millionaires overnight. New cars, paid debts, celebrations everywhere. And Kostas, who lived close enough to watch it happen, got nothing. Not because he refused, not because he was too cheap, because someone forgot to make one stop. That kind of luck feels less like chance and more like being edited out by fate. 29. Arnold Schoenberg spent years terrified of the number 13, and the universe responded by turning his fear into the most dramatic final scene imaginable. The composer suffered from severe triskaidekaphobia, an obsession that made the number feel like a personal threat lurking behind every calendar page. He dreaded turning 76 because 7 plus 6 equals 13, which tells you how deep the anxiety ran. Then came Friday, July 13, 1951, the exact kind of date that must have looked to him like destiny sharpening a knife. Schoenberg stayed in bed much of the day, trying to avoid disaster by simply not participating in life. His wife tried to reassure him as midnight approached. For a moment, it seemed he might outlast the date and prove the fear foolish. But then, just before midnight, he reportedly whispered the word harmony and died at 11:47, 13 minutes before the day ended. You could not design a more theatrical ending if you were writing a dark comedy about paranoia. He spent a lifetime fearing a number, and somehow the number still got the last laugh. 30. Roy Pearson took a lost pair of pants and somehow converted it into one of the most humiliating self-inflicted career disasters ever seen in court. In 2005, Pearson, a judge in Washington, brought trousers to a small dry cleaner. The shop lost them. That is annoying, yes. It is the sort of thing that should end with a refund, maybe an argument, maybe a bad review if you are feeling dramatic. Pearson chose a different path entirely. He sued the family-run business for $54 million, arguing that the sign reading "satisfaction guaranteed" amounted to a binding promise that had been violated. The case turned into a circus. He represented himself, made emotional claims about mental suffering, and even broke down on the witness stand over missing pants. The dry cleaners were dragged through years of stress and public attention. Then Pearson lost, which was obvious to everyone except apparently Pearson. Worse still, the spectacle damaged his credibility so badly that he later lost his judicial position. He torched his own reputation and career over a pair of slacks. That takes dedication. 31. Pete Best came closer to global superstardom than almost anyone in music history and still got pushed off the train just before it left the station. He was the original drummer for the Beatles, grinding through the ugly early years when success was still mostly a fantasy, held together by cold vans, rough clubs, and stubborn ambition. He was there for the unglamorous part, the part where bands become bands. Then in 1962, just before the Beatles exploded into one of the biggest cultural phenomena the world has ever seen, manager Brian Epstein delivered the brutal news. Pete was out. Ringo Starr was in. That was it. Within months, Beatlemania swallowed the planet. The group became more than famous. They became unavoidable. Pete then had to live in a world where every radio, magazine stand, conversation, and screaming crowd reminded him that he had once been inside the machine before it turned into history. Missing success hurts. Missing the Beatles hurts in a completely different category of pain. That is not a lost opportunity. That is a permanent haunting set to music. 32. Roy Sullivan worked as a park ranger in Virginia and somehow turned himself into the answer to a question nobody should ever ask, which is how many times one human being can get struck by lightning and still keep going. The answer, absurdly, was 7. He was hit while driving his truck, while out on patrol, and even near his own home. His hair caught fire so often that he eventually carried water with him, which is not a sentence you expect to read in a real biography. The odds of being struck once are already tiny. Roy treated that statistic like a personal insult. He ended up in the record books as the human lightning conductor, and people reportedly avoided standing near him during storms because they assumed he was basically a mobile thunder magnet. Yet the saddest twist came later. After surviving all that raw violence from the sky, Roy died by suicide at 71 after struggles connected to heartbreak. He could survive nature at its most savage, but not the quiet damage of a broken heart. Now argue about it properly. Who on this list was truly unlucky, and who was just making world-class stupid decisions? And more importantly, who did we miss that history absolutely humiliated? Drop the name in the comments and defend your pick like you are in court. If this video deserved your pain and your laugh, hit like, subscribe, and come back for more absurd history.